Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Price. I am going to record the last third of our preschool language lecture for language development class. So how do we think then about ways to increase the complexity of the input that Amy and Devon are being exposed to? We know that lower SES families have a tendency to talk less overall, and so they're exposing children to less language overall compared to middle income and upper middle professional families. What we want to focus on here is not just about increasing overall amount of language, although that can be helpful. We want to think about increasing the density of certain morphological markers and language structures. So we can target things like the copula and auxiliary be verbs, the auxiliary do verbs, do, does, did, third person singular, past tense ed, right? We want to increase the richness of the grammatical markings for children. So the way that SLPs address this is to use what we are calling toy talk. Hadley and Walsh in 2014 came up with the term toy talk. It's also talked about by Fitzgerald and her colleagues as descriptive and other focused. So instead of self-talk, I talk, I'm talking about what I'm doing, or parallel talk, which is you talk, you're putting the train on the track, we would be other focused. So being other focused helps us to use more third person singular. So to talk about the toy, that allows us to switch over to more third person talk. So he wants to go over that bridge. Does she go fast? She goes fast. So we're switching into third person singular tense. Other focused also helps us increase copulas and auxiliaries. So the train is stopping at the station. That's an auxiliary verb. The conductor was not happy. That is a copula verb. So we're getting more is, am, was, were into our talk. Another feature of Toy Talk is that it's other focused in the use of lexical subjects. So we're focusing, instead of using pronouns, we're focusing on the use of the actual lexical name. So pronouns lend themselves very easily to contracted forms. So it's big, or he's jumping, and so we much more easily contract those forms. Whereas if we say the doggy, we're labeling, we're using the lexical name for what we're referring to rather than a deictic term or a demonstrative. Or a demonstrative pronoun, we are labeling the doggy. So the doggy is big. We are less likely to contract those lexical subjects. Instead of he's jumping, we say the man is jumping. Finally, we focus on actions, and the focus on actions helps us, if we're using third person lexical subjects, then the focus on actions helps us get more of those third person singular markers in our input to children, and auxiliary and copula verbs. So toy talk is something that SLPs learn, and we apply these strategies in our treatment as a method, an evidence-based method for increasing grammatical morphological use in children. We can also help parents learn toy talk, and they can learn to apply these input strategies in specific contexts. Maybe during meal time or bath time, they will focus on, okay, during this time I am going to use toy talk. I'm going to use lexical subjects. I'm going to use verbs and switch my language to third person so that I embed more of these grammatical structures into my language. We're going to want to be very careful about making sure that toy talk fits into the family's cultural background. And so we just want to be aware of the cultural routines and activities and beliefs that parents hold, and adapt toy talk, teach them to use a toy talk approach that can be sustained within their culture and their home. So Amy could benefit from mom and grandma learning toy talk because it would help them provide more dense and morphologically rich input for Amy as she is learning language. That's helpful even though Amy is not a child who's exhibiting language delays. We are not concerned about her language development. But what we know is that the language of children who are growing up in lower income families is in many cases less sophisticated and has fewer a decreased range of vocabulary diversity. And so this would help parents provide a model that the child will learn more from. And that's not to say that what they're doing is wrong, right? It's saying let's learn strategies that can enhance your child's language development. And they are, mom and grandma are dedicated to helping Amy kind of break the barriers that they have faced in economic status. So there's often an embracing of these kinds of strategies. We would want to teach people to use those strategies during book reading, during toy play, during mealtime, and to practice those during specific activities, because what we know is it's hard to sustain toy talk all day long every day. That's just unsustainable. But if we can teach people to identify, well, when you're in the car, or when you're doing grocery shopping with the child in tow, how can you use toy talk at that time? So it gives us a chance to or parents a chance to identify and practice that skill or strategy during a limited amount of time and not feel pressure that they have to use it all the time. Now for Devon, his parents could benefit from applying these strategies because Devon, with his language delay, is not learning language in the typical fashion, and so he needs more input. Again, we're not trying to say that his two dads are providing an impoverished language model. They are not. But they in order to help overcome and kind of counter the delayed language that he's experiencing, can use toy talk strategies.
So we've been talking about input and how it influences grammatical development or morphological development. Let's now shift to receptive semantic development. So how is it that toddlers and preschoolers learn so many new words and concepts in their early years of life? What we know is that they develop receptive knowledge of words typically prior to their expressive use of words. 1-year-olds understand about 4 times the number of words than they can use expressively. So they're building receptive knowledge for a while before they begin to expressively use those same words. Now, what this means is that as they're building that receptive knowledge and they begin to use words expressively, it leads to errors in their word use. I pulled this in again because I felt like you were not fully grasping the whole underextension and overextension concept. So let's take an example. They may understand the words motorcycle, bus, truck, car, and helicopter, but label them all car. So they may have some receptive knowledge when they see those vehicles that they are different, but they don't yet have all the words for them, and so they will call them all car. That would be using a word too broadly compared to the adult meaning of the word. Another overextension would be calling all men daddy, which a lot of kids will do. If they see a man, they'll say daddy. Underextensions, on the other hand, are using a word too narrowly. So compared to the adult meaning, if they're using the word cup, but they only use it for the exact blue sippy cup that they use all the time, then they are exhibiting an underextension, a narrow understanding of the word. Now, with word knowledge building, when they do these underextensions and overextensions, they get feedback, right? So the grown-ups or the older children in their environment will fix it for them. So when they call a motorcycle a car, they'll get feedback from someone who's more competent at language, and they'll say something like, no, that's not a car, that's a motorcycle. And so underextensions and overextensions elicit feedback from adults. So there are several different hypotheses that explain semantic word learning. And we're going to work through each of these 4 hypotheses right now. Fast mapping is the first of these. The idea about fast mapping is that children form a link between a referent and a new label. So if there's an object in front of them and somebody and they hear a word, it's going to they're going to associate that label with the object that they're looking at. These are very quick mapping of meaning of a word. It's sketchy, it's tentative, it's incomplete for sure. And it's through repeated exposure to the word that the child then fully develops their knowledge of that word. So you can think of fast mapping as a surface level initial understanding of the meaning of a word. They have not yet developed rich, deep understanding of that word. So when they're forming that quick link, you can imagine that children who receive more overall input from adults or older children are going to develop greater vocabulary knowledge because they're going to get more exposures, repeated exposures. They're going to get more exposures to brand new words that they can at least fast map some initial word meaning to. When we think about fast mapping for children on the autism spectrum, we know that children with autism actually are often not looking in the right direction. They're not attending to the same object as the adult or the older child. And so their attention is diverted somewhere different. And so they may actually then be more impaired in learning new words because they're not noticing things like, oh, mom is looking at that toy motorcycle and I'm looking at the toy motorcycle, and then she used this word motorcycle, and I know that I can associate that word with the object. They're often in their own world doing their repetitive kinds of behaviors, or focused on their own objects. This is why it's really important for parents of children with autism to actually make sure they're talking about what the child is actually looking at, because the child with autism is going to struggle to understand the connection between the parent's eye gaze and the word and the object that they're referring to. A second hypothesis is this mutual exclusivity bias. So when children are young, infants, and some people will say that this is actually sort of an innate ability, that they're born with this ability to, this principle called novel name nameless. So the child hears a new word, they search for an object that they don't have the name for yet. So if there's the motorcycle in front of them, and then there's a car and a truck, and they already know that the car is called a car and the truck is called a truck, then when mom says the word motorcycle and is looking at these toys, the child knows, well, motorcycle must attach to this toy motorcycle. That must be the object that mom is referring to, because she's not saying car or truck, and I already know those words. So this is the novel name nameless principle. The word they hear is novel, they hear a name, and they look for the object or the action even that is nameless, that they don't have a word for. Now, of course, the baby's not thinking in that adult sort of way that I just described, but they have this propensity, or this ability to identify the novel object or action that the parent is referring to. Now, joint attention, of course, in this hypothesis also plays a role. The child can follow the speaker's gaze. Again, children with autism or visual impairments, we talked about autism, but also children with visual impairments can have slower word learning because they're not able to attend to the visual objects in front of them, notice where mom is pointing her eye gaze, and make connections. So even children with visual impairments who otherwise do not have an impaired language learning system may have slower word learning because they can't see. They can't see the objects that people are referring to. That means that with children who are visually impaired, we do have to be more intentional about making sure that they can feel the object. They can, we have to be more explicit in teaching of words. So hypothesis number 3 is the semantic feature hypothesis. So in this hypothesis, what a child is thought to be doing is that they perceive the features of an object or an action. They'll perceive the features of size, shape, movement, taste, smell, sound, and then by noticing those different features, they're creating an understanding of word meaning. So when they encounter, when they have a word for bird, they understand bird, they know what a bird is, and then they encounter an ostrich, they apply the features that they know about the concept of bird. And what happens is then they have to kind of refine the concept of bird and add or delete features. So a bird has feathers, it can fly, it has wings, and they know those things. When they encounter an ostrich, it has a really long neck, which differs from their concept of bird. It's very large, and most of the birds that, the bird that they have in their mind is small. And an ostrich walks and runs rather than fly. And so they have to kind of figure out, how does ostrich fit into this concept of bird, right? So there's a weaker connection between bird and ostrich. When they encounter a robin and someone says the word robin, they know, wow, that I have the word bird and that looks like a bird. But there are some new features that I haven't kind of entered into my concept of bird. Like a robin is red-breasted and it's small and it does hop on the ground. And so this is a little different than the concept of bird that I had. And so we have to expand and refine the entire concept of bird when new words are introduced. In this hypothesis, it's the semantic features, all of the features of the entity that they are using to add depth of word meaning. Finally, the fourth hypothesis is functional core. So the functional core hypothesis says that the child is pretty focused on motion or movement or functions of objects. So for example, when they're introduced to the word spoon, they're focused not so much on semantic features of a spoon, like in the last theory, but they're focused on the function or use of the spoon. This idea of interaction with objects is very Piagetian. So you remember Piaget from all of your psychology classes, right? The functional core hypothesis, or this idea that kids focus on function or use, is a cognitive-based theoretical perspective. So connect this back to the theories that we talked about. So they're developing word knowledge through direct, active, motivated interaction with the world. And when they interact actively with the world, that's how they learn words. And so the functional core hypothesis explains then that they achieve word knowledge and depth of word knowledge through this functional core method. As you learned when we talked about different theories of language development, these four hypotheses explain word learning together. So it's not that what we know now, of course, is that not just one of these principles or hypotheses are at play. We can have a child who is doing a lot of fast mapping. They're gathering a lot of initial surface level sketchy meanings of words as they are exposed to them. As they gain repeated exposure to those words, they might be analyzing them more specifically using this semantic feature approach and a functional core approach. So they might be focusing in on what actions they're doing with this object and really learning about the functions and adding that to their core meaning of a word. They may be taking notes on semantic features, size, shape, things like that. that help them develop and refine their understanding of words. And they also are likely using the mutual exclusivity bias, where when they are introduced to new words, they're looking in their environment for what they don't have a name for yet, those nameless objects or actions. So these four hypotheses really work together, and we know that they contribute in different ways at different times in children's development. So how do we use these four hypotheses about word learning in assessment and treatment? Well, in assessment, we can take language sample data on lexical diversity. We can understand then the total number of words that kids are using, and then look at the number of different words they're using, and that can give us a great window into their word learning and word knowledge. Another measure that's used in language sampling is the type token ratio. I'm less a fan of this one, and there's some research showing that type token ratio can underestimate or overestimate a child's word knowledge because it's so affected by the length of the sample. So if you have a sample of 35 utterances or a sample of 100 utterances, you may actually get a very different type token ratio number, but that doesn't necessarily indicate that there's a disorder or not a disorder. So number of different words would be the key data point to look at to understand lexical diversity. Now that would be lexical diversity in expressive language use, right? Because in a language sample, we are evaluating a child's output, what they have spoken in a sample time period. We could look at the semantic roles codes that we have in a sample analysis of a child's language, and we can look at what kinds of concepts are being expressed in their utterances. So that's another way to use to assess a child's lexical knowledge. We often use tests like the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test or the receptive one-word vocabulary test. So what we're doing there is we're analyzing their receptive word knowledge. Can they recognize and point to a picture on a page that represents the word that we're saying? Those are great ways to determine a child's receptive vocabulary because, like I said at the beginning of this section, we know that children, young children, will have perhaps 4 times the number of words in their receptive vocabulary than they are capable of producing expressively. So we don't want to just look at expressive language, we want to look at their receptive knowledge as well. I added this part about receptive language, so you're going to want to mark that down, kind of write that in your notes. Dynamic assessment tasks are another way that we can assess word knowledge. We can give, we do this sequence of testing them on their word knowledge for a set of words, then teaching them the meaning of those words, and then retesting them to see how well they learned from our instruction. What we're doing there is assessing how quickly can this child learn new words when I teach them to them. We also look at how much effort did it require to teach them that? Did we have to stand on our head and run circles and just really work hard as a therapist to get them to understand and be able to use these words, or did that happen readily? We gave a few examples, we modeled, we practiced a little, and they got it. So we're looking at both how quickly they learn something and how much effort is required for them to learn it. What about treatment? We can use these 4 hypotheses to teach vocabulary in different ways. We can help the child focus, for example, on semantic features or functional core, the functions or uses of objects. We can take an approach from one of these hypotheses that then helps teach a child how to learn words, not just teaching them new words. We can't teach a child all the words in the language by direct instruction, right? That's not possible. We'll never accomplish that task. But if for a child who's exhibiting language delays or a language disorder, if we can teach them principles for word learning, like, hey, look, if you notice the size and the shape and all the different features of this object, it will help you understand the object, right? So we can teach a word learning strategy of semantic feature analysis. We could teach the child that they can look at the functions and uses of objects, and that will help them understand words better. We can then assess the child's response to treatment in order to determine what are the best methods for them to learn words. And of course, kids are different, right? So they may learn words in 1 or 2 of those ways more readily than they learn them in the other 2. So we can use these hypotheses clinically. So last segment, let's talk about the pragmatics development that's happening in these preschool years. So going back to our discussion of pragmatics in toddlers, remember the communicative functions that we were talking about at that stage. So we are using Doerr's primitive speech acts to characterize the pragmatic development of young children, the kinds of functions that they use in their expressive language. So they're using typically single words or maybe 2 or 3 words to achieve these functions, and they're doing things like labeling objects, answering a question, requesting an action, requesting an answer or information. What's that? Calling out to someone, greeting someone, protesting is big in the toddler years. Imitating or repeating, practicing. They sit around in their crib and practice language. So we can use these functions to label the first words that children are using, or first word combinations. What's happening though in the 3 to 5-year-old time period? For preschoolers, they are starting to learn much more advanced pragmatic functions, and they're adding things like describing objects or events, describing plans, describing past experiences. Now notice when I say this that we're talking about a child who has better cognitive abilities, right? So I always talk to you about how language and cognition are developing together. So once children develop the cognitive abilities to talk about past and future events, that's a cognitive leap, isn't it? They then start developing the language and the pragmatic functions that go along with that, right? So now their language is going to shift to describing objects, plans, future plans, past experiences. Another function that emerges in the preschool years is stating facts and feelings. Now think about feelings. Feelings require an understanding of mental states in a way that's more sophisticated than toddlers. Feelings requires perspective taking, so being able to understand my own feelings and the feelings of others and how those may differ. So we've had a cognitive leap here. Another function at this age is narrating, so telling stories that are more sequenced and being able to share multiple parts of a story. Complaining comes in here, being able to complain. They get more sophisticated in their ability to reject or to negotiate or even manipulate what other people do. Again, think about the cognitive leap that had to happen in order for them to be able to do that. Criticizing or threatening. So the other thing that can happen here is they start developing this pragmatic function of criticizing. Now they are becoming more cognitively able to criticize, to be critical of what they see, to compare and contrast. They're able to threaten or, like I said, influence someone else's behavior, and that comes with an advance in cognition. So again, we have this nice parallel between developing cognitive skills and developing language skills. What we can do then when we're watching a child and kind of trying to assess where they are, we can look at what they're doing with language, and what they're doing with language will help us know where they are cognitively and vice versa. These are ways that we can assess children. What about pragmatic interactions? We've been talking about pragmatic functions. Let's switch to interactions. In the 3 to 5-year-old stage, children are learning things like how to initiate a conversation, how to establish the topic, how to maintain that topic in a back and forth multi-turn conversation. They're learning to use appropriate turn taking, so going back and forth in conversation rather than interrupting or taking a turn and then leaving the conversation. They respond appropriately to their partner. That takes a lot of language ability. You have to be receptively monitoring your understanding of what someone is saying, and then figuring out what to say back to them that's on the same topic, relevant to the utterance that the conversation partner just made. Children are learning to terminate or end conversations rather than just literally walking away. You know, toddlers don't initiate and terminate conversation in sophisticated ways. Preschoolers do. They start learning how to do that. Other things that are going on here, I wrote the 1 through 6 as sort of a sequence, right? So they're learning the sequence of conversational interactions. The other kinds of interactions they're learning are how to sustain attention to the speaker, how to use their eye gaze back and forth to, appropriate eye gaze. We don't stare at someone. We don't look away from them the whole time. We have a nice balance between looking at them, looking at what we're talking about, maybe objects or actions. They're learning to interrupt appropriately. They're learning to repair breakdowns in conversation or communication. So when something goes awry and maybe mom or dad are not understanding them, right? And they realize, look, daddy's not understanding me, and I need to find words that will help him know what it is I'm trying to say because he's not getting it. Right? That's a sophisticated pragmatic interaction skill. And they're learning more about talking about objects and events that are not present. So decontextualized language, abstract language, or what we have called cognitive and academic linguistic proficiency. So this is a time period when they're learning that level of interaction ability. There are two videos on YouTube that I want you to look up. I want you to go to YouTube and search for Conversation with a 3-year-old. Now, it's going to be a little tricky because there are a number of videos on YouTube that have similar names. Find the one with this exact title, and it's 3 minutes 52 seconds long. The second one is Typical Conversation with My 3-year-old, and that's 1 minute 49 seconds. So I'm teaching you how to find the YouTube videos that I'm referring to. So I want you to watch the two of them and talk about or think about who's initiating the topics. How are topics being maintained? How do conversations end? Are these 3-year-olds good at conversation? Then I want you to go to Cute 5-year-old Talks About the Weather on YouTube and ask yourself the same questions. Do some comparing and contrasting. What does this cute 5-year-old know about conversation that the 3-year-old doesn't yet know? And what's happened in the 2 years of intervening time? So the other thing that's happening in pragmatic development between the ages of 3 and 5 is that children are adapting to participants and to different roles that they play. So they're getting much more sophisticated in knowing how to talk to different people. So they will adapt to static characteristics like general intelligence. We know that children talk differently to babies, right? When you hear a 3-year-old or a 4 or a 5-year-old talk to an infant, a baby, or a 1-year-old, they speak differently, right? They know that they need to simplify their language. With babies, they might use that sing-songy kind of pattern. They might use child-directed speech features that we talked about earlier in the semester, the kinds of features that adults use to talk to young children. And we'll see 3 and 4 and 5-year-olds do that. That's pretty sophisticated pragmatically. They're understanding they need to adapt the way that they communicate for a younger child. They will do this with children who have some kind of disability. They will talk differently to them, more simply, in order to communicate effectively. So age was wrapped up in what I just was saying about talking to a younger child. They will match language ability. So if they're talking to someone and that person, they can perceive the characteristic that this person is talking in a less sophisticated way than me, and maybe I need to shift the way I talk so that we can understand each other. They will start altering their language and communication style based on status or familiarity. So they will talk to a stranger differently than their extended family members. They begin to understand that they perhaps need to talk to someone of higher status than them differently. So even in daycare, both my sons learned that they needed to talk differently to the director of the facility. And when the director got involved in something, they needed to be kind of more formal and more polite and more deferential. Children also, so those are static characteristics of a person that they respond to. They also adapt to the dynamic characteristics of what's going on in the present environment. So they will adapt during things like if they're blindfolded, if they're talking to someone else who's blindfolded, and they will use more specific language to tell them where to go and what to do. If they're playing, if they will perhaps pretend to play telephone, if they're on the telephone, they will learn that, you know what, when I talk to grandma about the book that I have in my hands, but I'm on the telephone, if I'm not on FaceTime, then grandma can't see what I'm talking about. And so I have to be more explicit with my language because otherwise she won't know. This is one of those cute things that we see in young children very often, right? So I call home when I'm away on a conference. I call home and before the kids go to bed because I want to talk to them. And mommy's away for several days, and that's a bit disconcerting. So I'm calling them, and they'll say, "Mommy, look what I made," and I have to say, "Honey, I can't see you. You have to tell me in words." As they get older, though, in the 3 to 5-year-old age range, they understand that I can't see it. And maybe they'll say, "Can I switch to FaceTime so I can show you?" Right? So they understand that dynamic characteristic of the interaction. Barrier tasks. We'll do a barrier task later in the semester. A barrier task is one where you have two kids who are, or me and a child I'm working with, will have the same materials in front of us. So I'll have a picture of a farm and all of these little pieces that I could put on the farm. And so will the child. But then I put a barrier up in between us. And this is a very good therapeutic strategy, therapy kind of task to help the child realize, look, you have to be more explicit with your language. So when the child says, put this one on the pond, and I have to say, well, I can't see what you picked. You have to tell me in words. Oh, pick the duck. Which duck? Do I want the brown duck or the more yellow duck? The brown duck. Put the brown duck on the pond. And then I might say, oh, anywhere on the pond, or in the middle of the pond, or on the side. And then they become more explicit with their language. That's a great kind of task to use for children with language disorders, to teach them these pragmatic adaptations that they need to make. And it helps them build specific language skills. So children who are typically developing in the 3 to 5-year-old age range, they begin to learn that they have to talk differently in the barrier task during the barrier game, because otherwise their listening partner will not understand them. Finally, children will, in this age range, start to adapt to roles. So we know that even young children will start to, when they're playing, for example, in the housekeeping area at preschool, one of them will be the mother. Now, there's some really fun and interesting research on what kids do when they're acting in different roles. So one research study talked about the mother. When they act like the mother, they're really talkative, they're polite, they speak softer, they use a higher pitch, they use more terms of endearment. They have longer utterances, longer turns. They tend to qualify. This might be a stupid question, but this might not be important, but and so they're mimicking some of the mother sorts of styles or role of language. In the father role, they might be more forceful, use a deep voice, louder voice, shorter utterances, direct imperatives, commands. Single utterance turns. When they're the baby, they might use a whining voice, short utterance length, and telegraphic type of speech. It's because they know that a baby speaks differently, right? So what they're showing us here is a huge development of pragmatic abilities. Last but not least, children pragmatically at this stage are learning the pragmatics of oral narratives. So the developmental sequence is that they'll initially tell a story by being scaffolded by someone else. So the parent or the older child is kind of asking them questions, helping them to provide the information that's necessary for the listener to understand the story that they're telling or the personal narrative they're telling. Then they progress to co-narrating stories where they work together. They can't quite do storytelling by themselves, but if they have a more competent language user who's able to kind of talk through with them, they both add pieces successively. They can then tell the story. And then finally, they move to being able to independently tell a story. Now, what we want to remember here is that oral narratives, culture plays a huge role in a child's style and technique of oral storytelling. So Heath in the 80s was doing this amazing longitudinal, long-term research study that has resulted in several books and just really rich data on how children are learning language. And what she was looking at, she looked at 3 different populations of children. She followed kids from white working class population area, and then she followed a group of black working class children who were in an African American English speaking community, and then she followed professional, more middle class families. Now, in that era of time, those professional middle class parents and children were typically white, and that persists today with not as much so as in the 80s, but because of systemic racism and institutionalized policies that prevent certain groups of people from advancing, we still have some of these language characteristics that are consistent and that prevail, that persist. So what Heath saw in the white working class group, those children, in terms of storytelling, they retold from a book or a real event, and they stuck to the facts, they stuck to the storyline, and they were telling stories that made a point or would have a moral, and so that's the kind of story that they would tell. In children from the black working class families, they based their stories on real events, for sure, but they also used exaggeration and elaboration, all of these creative features, because creativity is highly valued. Their stories were valued by their community for their entertainment value, right? So that was nurtured in them, and it was seen as really important that children be able to tell a really interesting and creative and elaborated story. So their stories looked different, and this was despite the fact that they were in a similar financial income status, but their cultures dictated differences in what constituted a good story. So this is just a kind of taster of a couple of different ways that pragmatics differ depending on group membership. And so children are learning group membership. They're learning how their community speaks, what their purposes are for speaking, what their interaction rules are for speaking and interacting. So let's take just a few features of African American English and the culture around the Black community. So children are learning early on perhaps to code switch, depending on how much they're seeing that in the adults in their environment. So they are seeing perhaps their parents speak one way in the Black community and another way when they're in a predominantly white grocery store, or on the playground with a whole bunch of families that are predominantly white. They may see their parents code switching into general American English, and then they start recognizing, well, I need to speak in different ways to these different kinds of people from different groups. So group membership is influencing their pragmatic interactions. They may be learning, they are learning rules about eye contact. So in the African American community, indirect eye contact is used when they are the listeners, and direct eye contact is used more when they are speakers. So they may have some misinterpretations as not caring or inattentive. So in the white community, they might look at children who are using indirect eye contact. If I'm speaking and they're not using more direct eye contact while I'm speaking, I might perceive them as not caring or not being attentive to what I'm saying. So then I can misinterpret that cultural difference in eye contact and interpret it as being rude or not paying attention. So you can see how then this could lead to, in a school environment where for the long haul, teachers are primarily white. Now we could talk about why that is, right? So segregated schools um, and teachers, white teachers were the ones who were in the public schools, and black teachers taught only in black schools. And when public education was opened up and quote unquote integrated, we could talk about that too, but integrated, what happened is that the white teachers were the ones who continued to be the teachers and held the jobs because the people in power to put them there were white. So we've got this systemic problem then now with not having enough, nearly enough. Like we don't have equality in the teacher workforce. We have many more white teachers. So what does that mean for a child who's black in that white teacher's classroom? Well, if they're misinterpreting a black child's use of indirect eye contact when they are the listener, they may be then making assumptions, right? So here come very subtle biases in how we interpret a child's behavior that go back to the group membership, the pragmatic expectations in the African American linguistic community. So in some children are taught in the African American community that eye contact with an adult is disrespectful. So the child's following a rule from their culture that they don't want to disrespect their teacher, but their teacher may then be interpreting it as rude, inattentive, not caring about what the adult is saying. Then that can spiral into the perception that the child is less competent or behaviorally a problem. Where does that go? That leads to the assumption or bias that the black kids are the kids who are getting in trouble more. They're not paying attention, they're being rude. No, they're not. They're following the linguistic rules of their linguistic community. And they're doing it really well, but then they're being discriminated against by people misunderstanding those linguistic rules. This is why it's so important that we understand the linguistic rules of a community of speakers so that we can interpret those pragmatic cues correctly rather than having our biases that come from our own linguistic community interfere with our ability to interact. So narrative style differs in AAE. I just talked about this, about elaborating, and we can call that a topic-associated style. So they may not have a story that looks sequential and linear like a white story would look. And so we can misinterpret again and assume that the child is less skillful at storytelling when indeed they're producing a story that's quite sophisticated and meets the expectations of their linguistic community. Turn taking. Turn taking is another area where speakers of African American English may look different than speakers of General American English. So interruptions and overlapping speech are perfectly acceptable. So I still, when I am in the midst of, pretty much I'm the only white person in the room, me and Joshua are the white people in the room, and everyone else is black, and there's these conversations going and they're overlapping, and the conversational floor is given to the person who's the most assertive or aggressive speaker, or there's multiple conversations going on at the same time, and one person might be contributing to 2 or 3 different conversations going on at the same time. I still find that very challenging to negotiate. I can't process and be involved in multiple conversations at the same time. I get lost. And yet, even the young children in the environment are doing it better than me, right? Because they understand the turn-taking expectations in their dialect, and I don't. So this is sophisticated. This is linguistically rich and rule-based. And here are these children participating much more proficiently than I am because they understand the rules of their dialect and their culture. Touching. In African American culture, you can, for approval or if you're agreeing with something, you touch someone's arm or someone's hand. But the touching of hair or patting of the head is very disrespectful. So you don't touch someone's hair. You refrain, right, from doing that. So you can understand then how we get ourselves into trouble, right? Because we don't have that same rule in our culture, in white culture necessarily, right? So in my culture, it is acceptable to touch someone's hair. And so I can then make a huge faux pas and be viewed as being disrespectful and rude if I touch someone's hair from the black community. Now, what I want to caution is individual variation is huge within any group. So I've just given you a smattering of a few features of AAE, the pragmatics of African American English, and just know that just like in white families or Hispanic or Latinx families, the variation among them is huge, even within their culture. So the risk here is that I've told you these characteristics and now you're going to believe that they're true about everyone who's black. And that's not true, right? There's huge individual variation. So let's do an analysis of Hispanic and Latino cultures. Now remember, when I say Hispanic and Latino cultures, what am I talking about? I'm talking about a huge range of different countries, different languages, dialects, and so we're talking about this very diverse, very large population of people. In Hispanic Latino culture, there's much more of a collectivist. They ascribe to a collectivist view of society rather than an individualistic society or individualistic focus. So, speakers of General American English, middle income white America, the individual is more important than the group. Personal goals are more important than the needs of the group. It's important to distinguish myself from everyone else. I'm supposed to find a way to stand out from the crowd, right? That's important. And so in the classroom, as a child, that's my job. My job is to stand out, to be my individual self and be recognized as individual and different from other people. Not so in a collectivist society. In a collectivist society, the needs of the individual are deferred to the needs of the group. Individual needs are deemed secondary. You do not consider your own needs over everyone else. You elevate the needs of the group. So if the group is doing something together, then you are part of the group and you don't try to make yourself stand out. You try to make yourself fit in with that group and work on the group goal at the moment. So you can see where these are in direct conflict with one another and how children in classrooms at school would have very different reactions to the same kind of a situation. In individualistic society, let's see, where am I here? Time. So the difference in how time is viewed across cultures is huge. An 8 a.m. meeting in America, middle-income America, means middle-income white America, 8 a.m. meeting means 8 a.m. It means you should probably be there several minutes early and in your seat and ready to participate in the meeting at 8. In a collectivist society, the event is much more important than the time that the event takes place. So if you're going to a wedding, I think I tell you the birthday party story, right? I think I've even told it to you already, but I, thought that I was like, oh my gosh, I couldn't find this birthday party my son was going to. I couldn't find it. I was late. It started at 1. It was 1 was the start time, and it was like 1:40. I was assuming at that point that I'd missed the birthday cake, right? We had missed the pizza and the birthday cake. And, I get directions, and I get there, and now it's like 45 minutes, 50 minutes into this birthday party, and so I waltz in, and I'm one of a very few people already there. And everyone who's there is setting up, and they're putting up decorations, and they're getting the tables organized, and I'm so confused because I'm thinking, I thought this birthday party started at 1, and I thought I was going to be hideously late, and here I am, and I'm helping put things together, which was fine, and the kids had a great time while the grown-ups were getting things set up, and the birthday party then eventually started as all the people arrived. So the focus was on the event, not on what time it started or ended, and another story is my grad assistant a few years ago was from Kenya, and she said, oh yeah, if the wedding, people are coming to a wedding, and some important people that are important to the bride and the groom aren't there yet, then you just delay the wedding. So you might delay the wedding, like the wedding might not really start until tomorrow because some important people aren't there yet. It's also, it wasn't a problem that some people came a few days later, and so they didn't get there in time for the wedding. The wedding had already happened, but they were welcomed in and fed, and they had, they just continued the celebration because those people had arrived, and the event of celebrating this new marriage was much more important than whether they were there. They weren't viewed as rude for not being there on the day of the wedding or the day after when it actually happened. They weren't considered rude. Now it's just like, oh, you're here to celebrate the wedding. And so what a very different view of time. And so then we, because of our own, if we don't have an understanding of the group membership, the rules of the culture, then we can have, of course, biases and negative prejudices about people for not starting the birthday party on time, or for this weird, like, we're all waiting around for this wedding but it's not starting. So the event is much more important than the time when the event takes place. In a collectivist society, family members, or family means the whole extended family. It doesn't mean nuclear family. In an individualistic society, family is the nuclear family. Difference in who counts, right? Who's being talked about when we talk about family. Authority is different. So in a collective society, there's great respect for those in authority, for the experts. So they will be more formal and distanced in their interactions with authority figures. When they come to see us for advice about their voice or their fluency or their child's language development, they're going to be very deferential and formal. And I might try to be more informal, because being informal, I think, puts the clients at ease and makes them feel more comfortable. But from someone from a collectivist society might see that as inappropriate on my part, and they will be trying to be very formal and respectful. Formality is the given in a collectivist society when you're talking to people who you don't know very well. Until you know each other pretty well, you don't switch to an informal style. So again, me adapting and using an informal style to try to put the family at ease is counter to their expectations. Which can cause miscommunication, misunderstanding between us, and then that can damage my ability as an SLP to provide good patient care. So, these are differences in the rules of culture and group membership that can then interfere with us understanding and relating to people who are different from us. So if you grew up in a Hispanic or Latino culture, then you may ascribe to, right, you're going to ascribe to and understand the cultural and linguistic expectations of your community. You can still then, of course, have biases against how other people are operating, because they're operating from a different cultural viewpoint. And so it doesn't matter what culture you come from. The set of cultural and linguistic rules that you have learned are going to be the ones you're biased toward, right? So that's what you're going to expect from other people. And when they deviate from that, you may have biases or prejudices against them, or misinterpret and miscommunicate with them. And so it doesn't matter what your background is. We all have to understand our own culture in order to understand the perspective from which we come, so that we can then realize that other people are coming from a different cultural perspective, and background, and that therefore we may miscommunicate or misinterpret each other because of our cultural roots. And this is why it's so important for SLPs to understand differences across cultures so that we can provide good treatment and build relationships with our clients. So I hope that you've gotten a sense now for throughout the whole lecture how children in these preschool years are learning grammar, how they're learning words or semantics, and how they're learning pragmatics and how culture influences their learning of pragmatic interaction and functions.